Welcome to the Seminar on Biblical Interpretation. This is our last lesson, but perhaps one of the most pressing issues when discussing biblical hermeneutics. Dr. Frank Hasel, Associate Director from the Biblical Research Institute, is here to tell us why.
There are many different approaches and hermeneutics out there competing with each other. And we have in the past dealt very much with the so-called historical critical method, and rightly so, because it has been a dominant and very influential approach in theology around the world. But in the last 50 years or so, a number of recent newer approaches to biblical interpretation have emerged, often in criticism of that dominant historical critical method, and often with an approach that sounds so much more like what we Adventists would like to support, where the canonical final shape of the biblical text is taken rather than a reconstruction of earlier sources and traditions that led to that text, where the literary and structure of the biblical text is emphasized in various approaches. We have never really dealt with some of these approaches from an Adventist perspective. We have dealt with the historical critical method, but now people see there is a wide spectrum of different approaches that sound so much more biblical and so much more attractive. So what are the strengths of these approaches, and where are some of the problems, and where are some of the things that we have to be aware of and knowledgeable of?
And who is presenting the subject?
The author will be Frank Hasel. I'm the Associate Director of the Biblical Research Institute at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Originally, I was born and raised in Germany, lived in Germany for many years, worked there as a pastor, and then as a Bible teacher at Bogenhofen Seminary for 18 years, where I was the director of the theology department and the Ellen White Study Center that we created there. And now I work at the BRI, at the Biblical Research Institute, at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. So as you deal with these things, you will probably learn a few new things. Perhaps you will have an opportunity to gain some insights, and they will hopefully help you to navigate your way through the many different approaches that are out there, so that you can knowledgeably deal with them and see what our Adventist evaluation of that would be.
We are back with Dr. Frank Hasel to learn about recent trends and methods of biblical interpretation. Dr. Hasel, a new understanding of history and modern presuppositions generated a whole arsenal of new historical critical methods. What principles are foundational to this modern way of thinking that is influenced by the Enlightenment and rationalism?
I could give a long answer to that question because there are many different methods out there on the market. They all claim to help in the interpretation of the Bible, but not all methods are equal, and not all methods are equally good in helping to appropriately interpret the Bible. So what we need to understand, this can be very confusing to many people, especially those who have never had any formal training in theology. And even for theologians, this is something that needs attention and careful knowledge of the material. What is helpful for us to notice is that there are some general trends that we need to understand when we talk about different methods of biblical interpretation, especially in the Western world, but through the Western world, basically around the globe, where human reason and empirical experience have become the norm for understanding the world around us and also for understanding the biblical text and studying history and the Bible. And this so-called historical critical method presupposes a naturalistic worldview and tries to explain everything, including the biblical things, in terms of natural laws. It excludes the possibility of supernatural intervention. They treat the Bible like any other book And thus, they actually do not really do justice to the repeated claims of the biblical writers that they have received supernatural revelation and divine guidance in what they wrote down. This approach has led to a variety, many different sub-approaches, sub-methods that all build on the same presuppositions, the same principles, the same basic structure. But they're different, and they emphasize different aspects. But we need to understand these principles in order to understand where they come from and whether that is indeed appropriate for us to use for Christians who take seriously what the Bible claims about itself.
Can one modify these principles and make them more acceptable to faith?
Yeah, let me explain that a little bit. It might be a new world for you. They've never heard about this, and you might not have heard it in this way, but this kind of thinking has certainly influenced Western thinking significantly. So this approach is commonly called the historical critical method. It actually consists of a whole ensemble of different methods. But if you look at them, they all build on three major principles that influence all the different varieties of that one methodology that I mentioned here. What are these three principles? They have been mentioned by Ernst Troeltsch. He was a German theologian and philosopher, and he has summarized basically that approach. He has not invented it. He brought it to the point, and he is being quoted even today as the one who has given us in the clearest possible form these guiding principles of that approach of thinking. So here are the three principles. Principle number one is the principle of criticism. Principle number two is the principle of analogy. And principle number three is the principle of correlation. So let's look at each of them separately, just briefly. When we talk about the principle of criticism, we are not talking about the exercise of critical discernment. We all should exercise critical discernment when we study something. We have a mind, we need to do that. But here, when we talk about the principle of criticism, it is the principle of systematic doubt. It is not a neutral approach in the analysis of the Bible. It has a decisively negative connotation, and it criticizes the Bible negatively, unfavorably. So this criticism is not neutral. It has a slant, it has a direction, and it has a negative direction. It has an inherent presupposition, an inherent tendency that calls into question the sacredness and the authoritative status of the Bible. It assumes that the Bible is a human product. It is not divinely revealed. It is not divinely inspired. And it subjects the Bible to these principles of critical examination. And on these principles of criticism, of this new thought, it inevitably, it always leads to a criticism of the content of the Bible. So this criticism is not just discernment, it is a criticism that criticizes the content of the Bible. It is content criticism. And this principle of criticism leads people to question the validity of sections of the Bible, whether that is applicable to me and whether that is any relevance to me, unless you have external proof that the Bible is correct. The Bible is not given the benefit of doubt, so to speak. So in the past, you would give the Bible the benefit of doubt if you would not have external proof. Now, this criticism turns this around and says, no. Unless we have external evidence, we cannot trust that the Bible is correct and trustworthy. So only when we have external evidence can we trust the Bible. The second principle is the principle of analogy. We believe that history and our human experience is fundamentally homogeneous. That means every historical event is similar, analogous to what we know today. And that means that the past history is known through our human experience in the now, in the present. And because all events are analogous, All events are similar. So the present becomes the key to understand the past. This principle, Church says, is all pervasive. It touches on everything. It cannot be just reduced to a few things of faith here and there, and the rest is not touched by it. No, he says it's like sourdough. You know, if you want to bake bread and you have the sourdough and you put a little dough, it affects everything. If you give it the little finger, it will grab the whole hand, he says, you know. So it's not possible just to give a little bit of that, but it affects everything in our thinking and in our explanation. It also makes our own culture and our own experience the dominant experience and the dominant culture. It becomes very ethnocentric. It is interesting that Troeltsch himself has called this method, he says, it has something devilish about it. And it changes everything, and it questions everything. This analogy is so powerful that it almost sounds like omnipotence, as if it can do everything. It is as if it has a divine quality about it. And the third one is correlation. All of our events are so interrelated and interdependent that there can be no radical change that can take place. Everything in this world has an immanent inner historical cause and effect. And any historical event and any historical text can only be understood in terms of its immanent inner historical context. There is no supernatural intervention. It's not possible. Miracles are categorically excluded. Does that undermine biblical faith? Yes, it does. Yeah, we have to say it clearly. This is what many people have reported that they have experienced. Yes, you know, if there are no supernatural miracles anymore, if there is no supernatural intervention, if there is no supernatural revelation of God, if there is no supernatural inspiration, there is no supernatural origin anymore that the Bible describes, a creation that is supernaturally created by God. There is no external authority anymore, and it affects basically everything. See, if you start with that thinking, you cannot just say, oh, I'll limit that to this part of my faith, but all the rest is not affected by it. If I start with that approach to interpreting the Bible, everything will be affected. It critically reconstructs the origin of the Bible. The Bible is no longer a book that was given by God to biblical writers. It is instead a human product. And what you start to do now is you critically reconstruct the sources and the origin and the factors that helped to create, humanly speaking, that particular kind of literature at that particular time. You go not to the text, but you go behind the text and reconstruct the history behind the text that leads to the production, the human production of the text. And usually that is something where you don't have the inspired writer write the book, but you have human authors write different pieces, and then later redactors put this together for you and create the final shape of what we today find in the Bible. And you can easily recognize from that, this fragmentizes the Bible. It puts the Bible into little unconnected different pieces that have no connection, that has no unity, and it robs the Bible, basically, its divine authority and its power. And indeed, for a disturbing number of students and pastors and preachers, this approach has led to a secularization of their faith. It has led them even out of the faith. It has led them to study the Bible with, as paradox as it might sound, with atheistic methods. It has led them to study the Bible as if God would not exist. And this, I tell you, has far-reaching consequences for our beliefs and for the biblical truth. But if you think about this, if there is no supernatural origin of this world, if there is no supernatural creation, if there is no literal Adam as a historical figure, if there is no fall, if there are no miracles, then there is no virgin birth. Then there is no bodily resurrection from the dead. Then there is no predictive prophecy that would tell the future. Then there is no supernatural regeneration. Then there is actually no answer to our prayers, because there is no living God who would act in accordance to what we pray. It leads to a different understanding of salvation, really. If there is no fall, if everything evolves and there is no fall, then there is no need for a redemption. There is no need for a savior, really. So it has a different understanding of salvation. It has a different understanding of judgment. And there certainly is not a supernatural second coming of Jesus Christ in power and in glory. So from beginning, creation to end, the second coming, everything basically is affected by that approach. If I don't believe that the Bible is given by God, then it affects the way I try to explain how that could have come about, humanly speaking, without divine intervention, just within the nexus of cause and effect here in this world. So it's a completely different way of approaching the Bible and of interpreting the Bible.
What are some advantages and disadvantages of the new literary interpretations of the Bible?
Especially in evangelical scholarship, where you tend to have more Bible-believing scholars, you have to understand that in the modern setting, this historical critical approach has become the dominant method of studying the Bible at any major university. So if you go to any major university, public university, and you study theology there, you are trained in the historical critical methods in its various forms and sub-methods that have developed and evolved over time. But with these principles, and this has become the standard, the norm, and the king and the queen of modern Protestant and Catholic scholarship, for that matter. Even the Catholic Church uses that. That raises the question, can that critical method that is so disturbant to our faith and that puts so many things into questions, can that be adapted? Can that be modified? Can we have a moderate version of that historical critical method that is not as critical as some others would like to use it, but still works on the same principles? And that is a very important question. And some have suggested to use a more moderate historical critical method, a modified use of that method that is not as critical, but is more open to faith and perhaps even to some divine aspects and intervention. And those who propose to do that usually tend to claim that the method in and of itself is neutral. And they would say, you know, this is like a knife. And with that knife, you can either carve a beautiful thing out of a wood, or you can cut it to pieces. And it depends on the interpreter how to use that knife. And you can use it or you can misuse it. And the method, the knife, in and of itself is neutral. I don't think that is really appropriate. Many have questioned whether this methodology that comes from a certain worldview, from a certain way of thinking that builds on certain presuppositions, really is neutral, but it has already a slant. It has already a bent, a propensity to criticism, so to speak. It is interesting in the evangelical world, you have many who have proposed to use a moderate use of the historical critical method. And I think sometimes people just, if you want to be accepted in scholarship today, and if you want to be accepted among the peers, your colleagues, and you want to publish in certain journals and peer-reviewed literature, then the temptation is very great to adapt the standard that is used by almost anybody and everybody around the world. For me, it was very interesting that German theologian and famous scholar Peter Stuhlmacher from the University of Tübingen has written on the historical critical method, and he was one of those proponents who opted for a modified use of that method. And he's perhaps one of the most prominent scholars who has done so. And he said, well, in addition to those three principles, criticism, analogy, and correlation, I will add a fourth principle that is kind of the moderation to the three other principles that we've talked about already. And he said the fourth principle that I would like to add is the principle of consent, of Einverständnis. And what he means with that is that we should not just be critical, we should not just accept everything from the analogy of the known and explain the past from the present and from inner biblical correlations, but we should also be consent to listen to what God has done throughout history in the church and in the believers throughout time. And that would open us up for the possibility of faith in the interpretation of the biblical text. It is very interesting for me to see how his colleagues at the University of Tübingen and beyond have reacted to his fourth principle. They didn't like it. And Hartmut Gese, the Old Testament scholar in Tübingen, and others, they gave him strong opposition and feedback. And it is interesting that in his later work, then, he wrote a big book on hermeneutics where he proposed a New Testament hermeneutics in German. Some books have been translated into English, where he proposed that fourth principle. And then in his later books, in his monumental 2-volume New Testament theology, in the introduction, he writes, I have given careful consideration to what my colleagues and friends have told me as feedback to my fourth principle. Having given careful consideration, I have concluded that we have to go back to the three principles that Ernst Troeltsch has given us. And they are, and he mentions them by name, the principle of criticism, the principle of analogy, and the principle of correlation. And he says we cannot do without them, and we have to use them. And that is very enlightening to me, because really here you have a moderate scholar who tries to build faith into that. And finally, he has to admit it will not really work. The principles are not neutral because they originate in a certain worldview. They originate in a certain kind of thinking, and they build on that thinking. If you start with that, it will never harmonize with faith. It will never harmonize with the supernatural. There are a few scholars, not many, but there are a few scholars who have been trained in that kind of thinking and actually had a conversion experience and have renounced that historical critical method, which is very unusual because it's a matter of pride and accomplishment and being accepted. But I have had the privilege of talking to one of those scholars, Dr. Eta Linnemann, a German scholar. She was world-renowned, a student of Rudolf Bultmann at the University of Marburg and other places, and had written books promoting the historical critical scholarship. She didn't even believe that Christ was alive until she had a conversion experience. And she told me personally. And she wrote then several books and renounced her former publications. And she made the amazing statement that she said, you cannot be just a little bit pregnant. Either you are pregnant or you are not pregnant. And if we start to use that, we cannot say we just use it moderately. Because once you start it, as Troeltsch said, it will not just take the little finger, it will grab the whole hand. It will permeate everything and will affect our whole thinking. And if we start that way, we will end there, and you just cannot do it moderately. It just will not work. And that is the testimony of several others as well. And so I think our Seventh-day Adventist Church has perceptively understood that challenge, has made a public statement in the document on biblical interpretation, the so-called Rio document, because it was adopted in Rio de Janeiro at the fall meeting there. And it's an official statement of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in there, we have made it clear, very explicitly clear, that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it appeals to every Seventh-day Adventist, the scholar and the pastor alike, and the lay member. So those who teach at the schools, as well as those who preach and serve in the ministry. And it makes it very clear, and it says that Adventists have rejected even a modified use of the historical critical method that retains that principle of criticism that subordinates the Bible to human reason. And they say this is unacceptable to Seventh-day Adventists. And I think we are right on that. And I'm glad that we as a church have made that decision, because it shows that for us, it's not human reason that is the final norm that starts to criticize the content of the scriptures. But we really want to go by the Bible alone and have the Bible as the source and norm for our theology.
What is the danger of studying the Bible only academically?
We have been very strong in the Adventist Church to speak against the so-called historical critical method. But nowadays, in the last 50 years or so, a number of more recent approaches of biblical interpretation have emerged. Some of these approaches sound very attractive, even to Seventh-day Adventists. And many Adventist students have felt that this is something that might be interesting for us to use, to take advantage of. So, for instance, we have what is being called canonical criticism, where a canonical approach to the Bible and to biblical interpretation has been promoted and proposed. Brevard Childs, Sanders, and others are leading representatives of that approach. Then there are so-called literary approaches, where we have literary criticism, rhetorical criticism, narrative criticism, literary approaches that, again, take the canonical text of Scripture as their starting point and look at the literary structures of the text, explore the literary dynamics of the text, be that the narrative flow, be that rhetorical questions that are raised, be that performance of what is being proclaimed, for instance, and the reactions that it has on people who listen to that. So what about these newer methods, some of these newer methods? And I've just mentioned a few of them, and they are not identical. There are many differences between them, but they have something in common. And the thing that they have in common is that they focus on the canonical shape of the biblical text, rather than in that they are a reaction, really, to the destructiveness of the historical critical method. The historical critical method has fragmentized the biblical text in 1,000 tiny pieces and has tried to reconstruct the process of that emergence of that text behind the biblical text, how human beings have come up with that in different traditions and different schools, and then others have put that together, and how that all worked and so forth. And if you approach the Bible from that perspective, the Bible loses its beauty, it loses its power to transform, it loses its ability to change your heart and mind. It just becomes an abstract academic exercise. And the unity of the text is lost, it's fragmentized. And so canonical criticism says, hey, we look at the final canonical shape of the biblical text. And that sounds beautiful. That sounds like what we Adventists say. But what many people do not understand is that it's not just canonical biblical theology, it's canonical criticism. This approach is not entirely free of critical thought. And some of these proponents and representatives, they are very outspoken and say that we need to use the critical methodology to reconstruct how the church has come up with their choice of that biblical text and how that came about. But we just focus not on the history behind the text. We do not focus on the reconstruction of the text, the hypothetical. We focus on the final form of the biblical text. Now, that is fine, but we have to be aware that it's not just the final form, but it also has a mixture of the final form and the critical reconstruction of the community who brings about that. And that raises a whole lot of other questions about inspiration. Does inspiration work on the prophet, on the text, or on the community who brings forth the text and decides which text is the canonical text, etc., and so forth. Now, with the other literary approaches that I just briefly mentioned, again, they focus on the canonical shape of the text, and they focus on the text as text. They look at the structure of the text and at the rhetoric of the text, and they uncover beautiful things. And for them, the redactor who put together the text, and again, it's not completely free of critical thinking, but they focus on the final form of the text. They do not reconstruct the text and earlier traditions of the text. They focus on the final form of the text. And for them, the redactor of the text is just a beautiful artist who has composed a beautiful artistic piece of literature. And they look at that literature and the dynamics of the literature and how that literature functions and how it evokes certain reactions and what it does. And we can gain many important insights, very valuable insights for which we are grateful. See, whenever people work with the canonical text rather than a reconstructed theoretical text, we Adventists are appreciative of that. But here's the thing that many people do not consider. For those who promote canonical criticism, and for many who promote these literary approaches, literary criticism, rhetorical criticism, narrative criticism, etc., they focus on the text. But for them, the text is the text via text. The text does not say anything about the historicity of what the text talks about. In other words, it's the world of the text, but the world of the text does not tell us anything about the historical reality that really existed and that really reports it truthfully. And this is something where we Adventists would have a huge problem with, because for us, the text and the beauty of the text and the canonical text is also connected to the historical dimension that the text reports. And we believe that the text is not just an artistic creation of an author, but also a text that gives us propositional information that helps us to understand what God actually did in history and that he actually acted in history, and that this is not just a text that evokes certain emotions in us, but that this text actually reports what took place. So I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul, when he says, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, and he meant bodily, literally rose from the dead, our faith would be in vain, he says. It's not enough that he talks nicely about the resurrection. It's not enough that the text makes many allusions and is beautifully artistically constructed to talk about the resurrection. If the resurrection did not actually take place, Paul says our faith in Christ would be void, useless. So for us Seventh-day Adventists, the text, and even a text, that is poetically, can still recall truthfulness about what took place. And so for us Adventists, to exclude that historical dimension of the text is something that is misleading and leads us to a misrepresentation of what the Bible actually talks about. Another more recent approach in biblical interpretation is the so-called postmodern or reader response criticism. And this is very interesting because, again, it points out something that is valid to a certain degree, but then overstates the point and leads us into wrong conclusions. So people who use that approach, the most reader response criticism or the postmodern approach, they would say that the reader actually is the one who is also involved in the text and in the meaning of the text. And for them, to a certain degree, this is true because we all are engaged with the text and we all come with different presuppositions, and we need to shape our presuppositions with the biblical text and be informed by the biblical text. But what the reader response criticism says is the meaning does not reside in the words. Meaning does not reside in the text. Meaning is created by the reader who reads the text. And that means that the Bible no longer is the source for its own interpretation, as we have in the Protestant Reformation and in Adventist theology. But here, the reader becomes the source who creates the meaning of the text. And depending on your approach to the text and depending on your background, you come with constantly changing new situations and circumstances to the text. And every time you come to the text, you create a new meaning because you are the creator of the meaning. So the focus is no longer behind the text, as in historical criticism. The focus is no longer on the text, like in canonical and literary approaches. The focus now is in front of the text with the reader. And the reader is the creator of meaning. And the meaning can be just anything. It's an open-ended process. It is never fixed. It is never certain. It is never finished. It is ongoing. And therefore, this open-endedness is very pluralistic. And you wonder, can that approach be able at all to lead into some form of theological unity? Is that possible, even from an abstract thinking? And it creates a pluralità, a wide spectrum of different approaches that can be very conflicting and very different, and they all claim to be legitimate. So I'm just indicating, if you look at that, and this is just a development of the last 50 years or so. And newer approaches are emerging basically all the time. It's impossible to do justice to all of them and their differences between them. These are very general thoughts, but I think we need to understand some basic principles that lead us to understand where are people coming from and where does that lead us. And then we can see the differences between the different approaches and appreciate them and so forth. But for us Seventh-day Adventists, I think this is important. And for us, meaning has never resided in the reader. And our meaning was not reconstructed behind the biblical text. We have always believed that the meaning resides in the text and that the author who wrote it gave that word and that message a certain meaning, and that meaning cannot be changed just by reading it in different contexts or so. There is a meaning, and that meaning can be found and can be detected and can be followed and can be understood, and it resides not in the reader, but in the text of the Bible.
What should be the guide for the Adventist believer to interpret the Bible?
I would say for us Seventh-day Adventists, our approach to the Bible is what I would call a biblical historical approach. It's not a historical critical approach. It's a biblical historical approach. It's biblical. And I start out with the Bible because the Bible really should be the norm and the source of our theology. It should inform everything. It should even inform the method of how I approach the Bible, and should inform the presuppositions, whether God exists or not. And I might not agree with that. I might have my questions, but if I give it the benefit of doubt, I at least have to accept that for the biblical writers, this was a reality that they counted with. And this was a reality that they thought exists. And I have to take that seriously. So for us, it's a biblical historical approach. And that is important because for us, it's not just the biblical, it's not just the text. See, for these modern literary approaches, the text creates its own world of existence, so to speak, that is separated from the historical reality that the text talks about. For us Adventists, that is not a separation. The biblical and the historical go together. You cannot separate the biblical from the historical. The historical is important because God acts in history. God reveals himself in history. His revelation is constituted in history and therefore becomes normative for all history, for all time. The historical is never to be neglected. There are some people who say, in our hermeneutics, we just focus on the spiritual things, the theology, but not on the historical questions, because the Bible is reliable in the theology that it preaches. But when it comes to historical questions, there are mistakes and there are, things that are not so reliable and we cannot really trust it. I don't believe that this is correct. And I don't think that we should follow that line of reasoning for a simple reason. I'll give you an example. In the Gospel of, not in the Gospel, but in the Epistle of Romans, for instance, Paul makes a very interesting theological argument for the justification of the believer by appealing to Adam, the historical figure of Adam. And he compares Adam with the second Adam, with Jesus. And just as the first Adam came and sin entered through the first Adam, throughout all, he says, so salvation comes to all through one man, Jesus. Now, in liberal thinking, there was no historical Adam. That's just a generic term. There was never a fall with historic Adam. It's just a general term for humanity. But this historical detail is important for the theology of Paul. If there is no historical Adam, then the historical Jesus would not make the analogy. And so for the Bible writers, historical details are not to be neglected. They are there to be confirmed. And they tell you that something actually took place and something actually happened. And God actually acted in history. And he will act in history again. And this is the hope that we have. And therefore, it is very interesting to me that usually the criticism of the Bible doesn't start with the big theological questions. The criticism often starts with the little historical inaccuracies, the little historical details that some people think might not be so important. Let's not be fooled and let's not be deceived into that direction. The historical details are very important to the biblical writers, and we should not neglect them. And so to us Adventists, the biblical historical approach is important. We have an historical understanding of biblical truth, and we have an historical understanding of prophetic interpretation. It's not just a futurism, it's not just preterism in the past. It's a historical unfolding of events that we believe where God acted throughout history and even until he comes again. So this biblical historical approach, I think, is much broader than the historical critical method, which limits every supernatural intervention and supernatural activity of God. We have a more open worldview. We are not as closed-minded that we say, no, any supernatural thing cannot happen because it should not happen and it cannot happen. So we believe if the Bible teaches that, there's a possibility that God can do that and that he has done this in the past. So this biblical historical approach is open to the supernatural element, to the revelation of God. It doesn't start with categorical criticism. It doesn't start with a naturalistic, close-minded worldview where we just accept the inner historical causal effects. We do not use methods that work on those naturalistic premises and presuppositions, but we value and respect the biblical text in its canonical form. And for us, The text of Scripture is the carrier of meaning. And that meaning is fixed, and that meaning can be understood, and that meaning can be unfolded, and that meaning can be applied. And it's not just a product of the reader, it's a quality of the text. And that makes the text so precious to us. And that is why the Bible for us Seventh-day Adventists, and the text of the Bible for that matter, is the final norm that settles the questions that are important to our life and our faith.
Thank you, Dr. Hasel, and thank you for joining us. It's been an honor to have your company. May God bless you and give you wisdom to study and apply the content we shared throughout these lessons. God's Word will never return empty, so may it flourish into new perspectives and new fruit as you read and teach the Holy Scriptures to others. May God bless you. For a deeper understanding of this topic, go to AdventistBiblicalResearch.org/store and buy the book, Biblical Hermeneutics, An Adventist Approach. For additional resources, visit AdventistBiblicalResearch.org.